I've been looking at a lot of move data and types and all sorts of Pokemon stats lately for videos, and while I enjoy asking and answering questions a lot, I really enjoy actually playing the games more. And occasionally, one of these questions actually means I can do both, thankfully. In this case, I was looking at the move data for Generation 1 and thought to myself that the available moves in Generation 1 are actually pretty good for what they are. I've been critical in the past of certain types being underserved with powerful moves, or lacking accuracy and the like, but overall, for the context of the first games, I thought that Generation 1 was pretty well sorted. Which led me thinking that even though hundreds of moves have since been added to the games, you could probably still quite easily beat newer games with just Generation 1's moves. I'm loath to call that a challenge run since I just said easily beat, but it is the term for a game run with some kind of player-imposed restriction. So I did a little planning and got to gaming. The first thought was which game to play. Here I had some internal debate. It had to be both a game I felt like playing all the way through again and wasn't Generation 2 or 3, since I feel that they were too close together to call older games. So I settled for Generation 4 with Pokémon Platinum. Generation 4 is probably my favourite generation, maybe tied with 3, so it's always great to have an excuse to play it again. For those of you saying that a game that came out 17 years ago isn't older at this point, older is relative to Red and Green, which were 12 years old when Platinum came out. I don't see an issue with calling that older at that point. The next step was to see what moves I could actually make use of. Generation 1 has 166 moves in total, which honestly is quite a lot. Many of them are probably useless to me for this purpose. I doubt I'm going to be using Wrap or Bind much, but it's good to have a lot of options. To put the restriction in context, in Generation 4 there were 467 moves total, so I would be restricting myself to 35.5% of all moves. This to me seemed like a healthy restriction. Not too few moves to make the game impossible, but not so many that it's not different enough from a vanilla playthrough. With my parameters in mind, I started to do a little bit more planning. In the past, when I've done challenge runs, I've gone in blind, because I've been relatively confident that I could finish the games in one sitting for games like Red or Emerald. However, Pokémon Platinum is a significantly longer game than either of those. The world record speedrun is 3 hours and 35 minutes. If I wasn't careful, this could easily take me well over 6 hours, and I did not want that. So planning and routing it was. I would decide on Pokemon and their movesets, assessing them for viability in this context, as well as making sure I had an HM user in each case. I didn't think I needed a full team of 6, but I also didn't think that the usual single main strategy of Pokemon speedruns would really work with such a restriction on moves. I settled on 3 to 4 Pokemon plus B-Barrel for HM usage. In the beginning, I would start with a Piplup and a Starly, which I think balance each other out quite nicely, and they both get access to decent moves in each case. Starly gets Wing Attack and Quick Attack really quickly, and Piplup gets Bubble and Peck alongside Pound. I was initially intending to play this through with minimal spamming of X items and healing in battle if I could, but it did not take me long to see that this would just not be possible. With the restrictions on moves in place, I could not afford to leave other strategies unused. Before I talk about how the run went, I was curious to see what the power of the moves in Generation 1 was compared to the moves from Generations 2 to 4. My impression of Generation 1's moves is generally that they have good coverage for a lot of types, but many of the attacks simply deal damage, and the majority of them are lower power normal type moves. This impression is largely upheld by the data. The average power of all directly damage dealing moves in Generation 1 is 68.05, compared to 65.5 in Generation 2, 79.4 in Generation 3, and 84.23 in Generation 4. To be clear, this is for the moves introduced in each of those generations, not including any previously introduced moves. So yes, the trainer Pokemon in the game would by and large have access to more powerful moves than I would, on average. Was I deterred? Not in the slightest. Also, fun fact, In Generation 2, there were both 251 Pokémon and 251 moves. This meant that each Pokémon could use one move each. Great job, Game Freak. Very fair. And I was off. Streamed live on Twitch, by the way. Follow me there if you want to see more runs. I'll give a quick blow-by-blow of the major fights, starting with Rourke. He was not the easiest, but also not the hardest. I am on record as saying that Rourke is the hardest first gym leader in the series, and I stand by that. Cranidos' massive attack and access to Headbutt is not easy to deal with, but a fortunate crit and bubble combined with Torrent HP won me the day. Mars took a couple of attempts to have the fight go my way, but I wouldn't call it difficult. I managed to sneak by in not too much time. Gardenia was much the same with Mars. Prinplup was basically useless here, but it was a great chance to level up my Staravia, which was necessary for beating Gardenia. It took a couple of attempts, but pretty quick overall. Then we come to Jupiter. This one was tough. I had to leave and fight several grunts to level up enough to get past the stun tank, and even then it required a decent amount of luck. This took me just under 20 minutes to beat, grinding for more EXP included. Fantina. Oh boy. Oh gosh, this was a hard fight, and one that I had to use kind of a cheesy strategy to win. I also had to grind for EXP to get past Fantina, and I only beat her in the end because I figured out that if I spammed double team with Staravia, Miss Magius would be more inclined to use Magical Leaf to guarantee dealing damage rather than Psybeam, which usually did around half of my HP. This fight took me over 30 minutes to beat. Maylene, as a change, was really no trouble at all after I realized that I should not set up on Meditite because it has Rock Tomb. Staravia with a few X attacks made light work of Machoke, and Lucario wasn't too painful. Wake was tricky but not impossible. Floatzel deals a surprising amount of damage to Staraptor, even when not using Ice Fang. Wake's tendency to use Brine in this fight makes setting up tricky at times, and Floatzel outspeed Staraptor. I did get slightly unlucky here after Ice Fang froze me, but I still managed to sneak through. Byron was tricky to get past the setup necessary on the Magneton with Empoleon, but after that it was a breeze. Having a big, tanky Empoleon at this point was important. It was also at this point that Staraptor started to fall behind in usefulness, and I had to rely more on Empoleon, who now had access to Stab Surf. Candace was easy, breezy, and beautiful. No trouble at all. Cyrus was mostly fine. Setting up took a lot of healing, as both Houndoom and Gyarados dealt decent damage against Empoleon, but no major issues once I was set up and spamming Surf. I also now had Ice Beam to guarantee kills on Honchkrow and Crobat. Volkner would have been impossible with either Empoleon or Staraptor, but I now had Giratina, which resists electric type attacks and could spam Strength to get the job done. This would not be viable without massive X attack spam. The Elite Four and Champion were all differently paced variations of the same thing. Very slow, but massive setup using X items, then sweeping in one way or another. Except that Aaron, Bertha, and Flint all caused me trouble along the way. By this point, Staraptor really couldn't keep up given that it was just too frail to take attacks and set up, and I wasn't going to win the fights with just Wing Attack, Fly, and Takedown. So that left Giratina and Empoleon to lead. Giratina basically can't deal any damage in altered form, so setting up any more than 2 Pokemon without running out of PP was a problem, especially as multiple Pokemon in the Elite Four have Pressure as an ability. I didn't have any PP restoring items, which meant that conservation was crucial. Each time, both Giratina and Empoleon fainted at least once, which slowed me down immensely if I needed to set up again. I got through these fights, but it was a real toil to do so. On Lucian and Cynthia, I spammed X items of all kinds to high heaven and then simply rolled out. Not much resists ice, water, and flying, so these last fights turned out to be kind of a breeze. And that was my run. I was kind of surprised to find that as I played through the game, the major issue was not the lack of access to moves for me, but rather opposing trainers' access to more advanced moves than mine. Yes, I was able to deal damage, inflict statuses, and boost my stats or lower theirs, But that's kind of all you can do with Generation 1 moves. They offer decent coverage and there's plenty of mid to high damage moves available, but the trouble is that you are being constantly outclassed. For example, constantly being hit by Brine in Wake's gym was menacing. It totally neutered my ability to set up with X items and sweep. In other cases, the opposing Pokemon had access to moves that don't check accuracy like Shockwave or Swift in the fog, and I had to rely on moves with lowered accuracy, which was a real struggle. It wasn't so much that I couldn't deal any damage, but more of a I'm playing checkers and they're playing chess type deal. They could just play a much more complex game than I could. It also physically hurt me to have to not teach better moves like Aerial Ace over Wing Attack and deny Staraptor the pleasure of learning Close Combat when it evolved. I'll take this chance to remind people that you could beat the game in 4 hours with Staraptor solo, but not without moves like Close Combat. Another problem was how limited I was for Pokemon choices. Yes, there are plenty of options to choose from in Sinnoh. Lots of them learn Generation 1 moves, but very few of them learn 4 useful Generation 1 moves that would help me get through the tough fights. I looked at running Machop through the game, but seeing the moves it could access from level up from Generation 1 quickly dissuaded me from doing so. I was also not that interested in being capped at the lower base stat total Machoke for the rest of the game. I had originally planned to run a fuller team of 3 to 4 Pokemon, but getting past fights in the early game proved too difficult to be able to spread experience around. And even though Staravia does well with Wing Attack, fights like Jupiter and Fantina took me a really long time. It doesn't help that, to start with, Prinplup has Bubble until level 19, and Gardenia doesn't offer much chance to get leveled up. My reflections are that the limitation of using just Generation 1 moves dulls the game dramatically. There are good moves and ones that served me really well. I couldn't have beat the game if I did not go out of my way to pick up Ice Beam, and Surf and Drill Peck were excellent in the end. But it really does not compare to being able to use more varied attacks that can deal damage and have interesting secondary effects, or use more advanced status moves to your advantage. When I fight Cynthia in a casual playthrough, I love to set up Toxic Spikes with Roserade and then take my time knocking out each Pokemon. I really couldn't get that satisfaction by one-shotting everything after using 30 X items. This brings me to my more philosophical point. This was not really a fun self-imposed restriction to play the game with. I am a big fan of challenge runs and speedruns, and this was a relatively unfun combination of both. As a speedrun, it felt way too slow to be enjoyable. Spamming X items and sweeping is a fundamental strategy in Pokemon speedruns. We simply would not have the times we do without it. But it's usually quite fast, maybe a few turns of setup balanced against the time loss of slow turns not dealing damage. In this case, setting up took an eternity, and I spent minutes on individual fights just using X items, healing, and repeating before I could even attack. This took the fun out of the speed element of it, so what about the challenge? I think that the fun of challenge runs is that they force you to play in novel and unique ways you otherwise would not in order to progress. The old limitations breed creativity mantra and all that. I think it's great, and it has led to some excellent gameplay and cheesy strategies over the years. In this case though, the challenge deliberately kneecaps your very ability to adapt and try crazy things, reducing your ability to boost stats or deal damage. It's not that there weren't any status moves in Generation 1, but they really didn't help me here. Without the creative use of status moves, weather effects, using moves with unique mechanics like Brine, I felt like I had no options but to buff stats into oblivion and then sweep. Which is fine and fun if it's fast and it feels fast, but it was not. It was really slow. So I couldn't make the restriction into any kind of creative strategy for each fight, and it slowed me down enough to make the fast part redundant, meaning I was left with nothing really to like. This was not a good challenge run, and I don't recommend that you do it. I think my impression on this is backed by looking at how the meta game for Red, Blue, and Yellow works. The guide notes that the meta is a centralized, unbalanced, and very limiting metagame. This was my experience based on the moves I could use. Unbalanced and limiting, but without the specific quirks or charms of the mechanics of Generation 1, which are a world apart from Generation 4's. Before I made this video and did the run, I was going to test the question again in a Generation 5 game as well, but now I would rather lay on a couch and stare at a wall for the equivalent amount of time that it would take to do that. And that's all I had, folks. Is there an obvious strategy here that I missed? Would you play this run substantially differently? If you liked this video, please like and subscribe, it helps the channel out a bunch. I've also been speedrunning a lot lately over on Twitch, so follow me there if you want to chat between videos. Thanks for watching, see you next time.